right, welcome to Two Cooks Talking. I am your host, Nguyen. I am not an expert on cooking, but I do enjoy food. With me, as usual, is Executive Chef Michael Weller, who is an expert on cooking.
I certainly enjoy food.
Yeah. Okay, kind of continuing on from our last episode, we were talking about garlic. And so I like these singular focused episodes because I think having a library of episodes where people would say, "Oh, I want to listen to the episode of garlic," or in this case, we were talking just a second ago. This episode is going to be about salt, and so having a podcast list and saying, "Oh, there's a salt episode. I want to learn more about salt." So let's talk about salt.
Fantastic.
Salt is in every cuisine. I can't imagine any cuisine where they're like, no, no salt.
Even before cuisine,
Yeah.
one of the things our bodies are hardwired, like genetically set up, predisposed to crave, is salt. We can't, you can adapt your diet, you can do things for health concerns if you wish, but you cannot deny that salt gives us pleasure on a very basic level.
You say that just now, and my mouth literally waters as just thinking about salty food. I'm actually looking at a bag of pretzels, and I'm like, that looks pretty decent. Um, so, you know, we were talking about kind of going to the Scandinavian countries, and they weren't able to get garlic. I know salt is in huge abundance there. Salt comes from the sea. All salt comes from the sea.
No, there are underground sources of salt as
All right.
well.
Okay.
So you can have a salt mine
All right.
and dig salt out of the earth. But a good, even the salt that we're digging out of the earth probably has a source connected to water at some point in time.
Yeah, maybe some sort of dried up bed somewhere.
Right,
Yeah.
covered over. But
Yeah.
salt is a mineral. The Himalayan pink salt that is such a rage for good reason. It's just cool.
Yeah.
That's a rock crystal that
Right.
gets mined. So, I mean, salt is that basic. So many. I mean, you can just look at expressions. Salt of the earth,
Hmm.
right? Salt comes from the Roman word for salary. Soldiers were given salt as their
The
pay.
currency. Yeah.
Yeah. It is one of my favorite things about salt. A superstition prevalent to this day in a kitchen is if you spill salt,
You throw it over.
you throw it over your left
Yeah.
shoulder. That's got some really sound, fundamental cultural reasons behind it. Salt is that valuable, one, because we crave it, and two, for most of human history, about the only thing you could do to preserve food was to salt it.
And that's a key thing. It's not just used for flavoring food. It's been used for preserving for just about as long as it's been used.
So obviously, from a certain point in human thought, if a piece of meat is good and when we eat it we get sustenance, then whatever is making it go bad, is evil. Salt prevents the evil. Salt must be good. So salt gets this association with good because it wards off the bad evil in the world.
Oh wow, didn't know that.
So when you spill salt, that is potentially a problem. You have wasted something that has a holy aura behind it. To thwart that bad luck from hitting you after making this mistake of spilling salt, you pick it up with your right hand. Your right hand is your good, holy, in most European cultures, your good hand. If right side is good, your left side, in French, it's sinister.
Yeah. I was
Your
thinking Latin is sinister for left. So
yeah. So if right is good, left is bad. If the devil is going to approach you, he's going to come over your left shoulder. So if you invite trouble on a cosmic scale by spilling salt, you can stop that or thwart that bad luck by picking up some of the spilled salt and throwing it over your left shoulder. And that's kind of the origin. But the idea being that from ancient times, salt was thought of as good, as holy, as that important. So we have a physiological craving for salt, and we have a cultural drive to venerate salt. I think you combine that with the undeniable kind of chemical level impact of salt.
Hmm.
Salt does things to food that you can't get away from. Now, I fully recognize that many medical experts have suggested lowering our sodium intake. For people with hypertension, it has been shown to be a very healthy thing to reduce your salt intake.
Mm.
Big believer in that. Big believer in that. But don't lie to me, right?
Yeah, I agree there. I mean, I do enjoy reading. I find food sciences interesting, fascinating, and I've read very many things about how the myth of hypertension and salt has been thoroughly debunked several times over.
However,
Mm.
once people have and are suffering from hypertension,
Hmm.
a percentage of those people are adversely affected by salt and can benefit from reducing their sodium intake. But don't tell me the food's going to taste the same.
Yeah.
It's just not. One of the big differences between cooking at home and cooking in a restaurant that you pay money for
Mhm.
is in a restaurant we use salt. We use salt, and you can't get away from that. It changes food on a molecular level.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite things to do is what actually got me introduced to cooking mostly was cooking steaks. And using salt to denature the protein is incredibly valuable, incredibly useful just to make the meat more tender, make it more flavorful. It just gives a lot more pop to the meat.
Right.
Mm.
And I love herbs,
Mhm.
and you can put herbs on the outside of a steak and make it taste good, but again, let's be honest about it. There are things that you can't get away from without salt.
Right. And then,
Salt carries flavor in too as well. I
mhm.
mean, so we know what it does for denaturing the proteins,
Mhm.
but it also through osmosis brings flavors into meat. The whole idea of a brine not only tenderizes the meat, but as the salt enters, it can carry other flavors with it and affect and impact flavor
All
that
right.
way.
And I just realized that we're tossing a little bit of jargon around, so probably helpful to explain kind of what some of that stuff means as we go along. So denaturing a protein is um, protein cells kind of have like a shell, right? They're
Protein looks the structure of a protein involves long strands wrapped with other strands,
hmm
tightly wound and coiled. And denaturing means uncoiling
yeah,
them.
loosening it up.
Loosening them up
Hmm.
is a good description for it.
And that allows for one thing I do is I put black pepper down and maybe some rosemary or something like that, and then put salt in it to kind of draw the we were talking about drawing the herbs into the meat as it's denaturing because you break down those proteins and suddenly it's got room to meld with other flavors.
And the other thing happening there goes back to thermodynamics,
Mhm.
but basically in um, the universe craves equality.
Mhm.
So if within a cell there's no salt, and outside of the cell there's a lot of salt,
Mhm.
the cell walls will allow salt to enter in order to establish an equilibrium,
Right.
a balance. As that salt enters, it can carry with it other flavors.
Mhm.
So that's the way that a brine impacts flavor or enables you to interject flavor.
Yeah. Uh, Kind of continuing on with the science aspect of salt, it's also it has some value with changing melting temperatures and boiling temperatures. So typically in ice cream, you have salt. I think it both as a flavor, but also to keep it kind of a little bit colder. Is that right?
That's correct, and
Mm.
it works at the other end of the scale as well.
Mhm.
Now, the reason that you put salt into pasta water
Mhm.
is because salt tastes good.
Yeah.
It does raise the boiling point slightly,
Mhm.
but not enough to impact things.
Right.
It's like a science trivia gotcha question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to raise the boiling temperature, but it's not enough to impact any cooking times or
Right.
anything like that. But it does impact on both ends of the scale the whole transitional phase of water moving from a liquid to a gas or from a liquid to a solid, and salt impacts that.
Um, when we were talking about on our Pantry's Essential episode about salt a little bit. My favorite, and pretty much I'd say 90-95% of the salt I use is kosher salt. It's got larger grains. It's a little. We mentioned the pinchability of it. It's just there's something very chefy to grab a pinch full of salt and throw it in your food, and I like that. I like the textures, the kosher salt, because of the larger grains. It's got a lot more texture to it, as opposed to a iodized table salt or a sea salt, which tends to be a little more fine. Is that right?
Sea salts vary, but definitely table salt. And I don't want to just skip past that. There was a moment of government level brilliance, I think. Early on in the history of the United States, there was a serious health problem. People in the United States were not getting enough iodine in their diets. It was causing actual health problems. And the government said, well, what can we do to get just a small amount of iodine into people's diets? And the realization was, if we iodize the salt, people will naturally treat this iodine deficiency every time they salt their food. It was a brilliant stroke. It worked wonderfully at a time where, so much of that problem has gone away with the improvements in transportation. So if you live in Ohio, you can get a piece of salmon. Right? We don't need a lot of iodine. We typically get iodine from seafood.
Yeah.
But before the transportation got to a point where you could get fresh seafood anywhere in the United States, it was a stroke of brilliance to iodize the salt. It worked with no drawbacks. But we don't need the iodine anymore. And table salt is slippery as heck.
Yeah.
And it's dangerous. One of the rare places I really enjoy using table salt, granulated salt, is applying to fried food right out of the fryer. So the surface of a fried food is craggy and bumpy, and if you get a magnifying glass out, you see crevices and mountains and canyons and in the texture of the food. Kosher salt is shaped like flakes,
Right.
like dandruff, and those flakes often don't penetrate well into the craggy surface. Table salt with its little tiny ball bearings drop into those canyons and holes, and stick a little bit better. But I've never gone to the point of having both salts available on a cooking line and just using it. In a perfect world, table salt works better for salting fried food.
Yeah.
But
Kind of going to, you were talking about Himalayan pink salt. From what I understand, colored salts come from impurities. Is that sound about right?
that's exactly correct.
Okay. Is there? I probably couldn't tell you the flavor differences between a kosher salt versus a how did you call it, Himalayan pink salt? What do you?
If I gave you a small bowl of Hawaiian pink salt, you would instantly know you were tasting something different. If I gave you, I actually have a wonderful present from a good friend. I have a little pocket-sized container of Maldon Sea Salt. If I gave you Maldon Sea Salt and you tasted it, you would immediately know this is not kosher salt. This is something entirely different, entirely better. But it costs a lot. And there are people who have a food budget such that they can salt their pasta water with hand harvested sea salt. I'm not that person, and I won't ever be that person. But much as you use your really expensive and high grade extra virgin olive oil in a salad where its impact will show up, some of the flavored and nuanced sea salts can be applied at the end, where the distinctive flavor and the distinctive texture have a chance to shine through.
As a finishing salt.
Yeah.
Okay. What makes a sea salt different than other salts?
The impurities.
Okay.
So it actually has a terroir. It has a sense of place. And some salts from around the world have become famous because of the additional flavors associated with it. It is beyond salt. It's salt and. And I think probably bias growing up on the west coast of the United States, Hawaiian pink salt is one of those salts that definitely has that known salt flavor.
Hmm.
And in like lomi lomi or dishes like that where a raw salt will show up, that distinctive flavor is important.
Okay. Um, Now, when using salt, I think one thing we can briefly touch on, we talked about it off air about correcting cooking mistakes, but salting can sometimes be a problem if you have a little bit too heavy a hand. One thing that I like to correct salt is with sweetness. That's kind of I think they marry together very well, and it doesn't bring down the salt. It just balances out with a little teeter totter of sweetness.
It helps in the applications where that's viable, right?
Right.
Adding a little bit of sugar in some dishes will help. If
Mhm.
you're making maybe a vinaigrette, if you oversalt it, a little bit of sugar is not going to destroy the functionality of the vinaigrette.
Mhm.
If you're making potato and leek soup and you oversalt it, sugar's not going to help you.
Yeah.
It's just going to add a whole new range of problems. So
Yeah.
fixing oversalting is a problem. Fortunately, depending on how you salt, it's less likely to happen.
Mhm.
So one of the things where people who don't spend a lot of time cooking watch like a cooking show
Mhm.
is they are stunned by the frequency they see the chef salting food.
Yeah.
But there's a reason for that. If you cook a bowl of rice, for instance, now important caveat: if you cook it in most Asian cuisines, you shouldn't salt it.
Right.
But assuming you're making a bowl of rice for a French dish in a
Mhm.
European application, and you don't salt it at any point in the cooking, and at the very end, you salt that rice, I can tell you immediately that you salted the rice at the end.
Mhm.
The flavor perceives as being a coating. Chefs salt throughout the process because it gradually builds a flavor profile.
Mhm.
Chefs salt throughout the process because of the other properties of salt. If you have onions cooking in a saute pan in some butter, you salt the onions because the salt pulls the liquid out.
Yeah.
Once the liquid is out of the onion can then caramelize and brown. So salting throughout the process means it's less likely to make a mistake of oversalting because it happens gradually and you're tasting as you go.
So you know when to cut back once you reach that point. And you're talking about building a flavor profile. It's kind of building kind of a depth and integrating the salt through the food so that it's more than just salt, really. Right.
Fabulous. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love your word depth is really important. Nice word.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and you were talking about yeah, onions was actually one of the first things where I really learned to salt as I go. Mushrooms as well. I think they benefit greatly from salting and also bring out the moisture mushrooms. And then mushrooms also do the cool thing where they suck in everything around them too. So that's what I like. What other? So I think we talked about truffle salt a little bit a couple episodes ago. Um, I don't know, what other salts are there? There's
The various sea salts
mm,
gathered in different ways.
mm,
The Himalayan rock salt has been used for plates. It's a large, flat surface of salt, and it does food that you place on it dissolves a small amount of the plate
hmm.
and effectively seasons the food. The various styles of salts based on the impurities present in the salt
Right.
give you a range of flavors there. Size also has impact. Size and shape. I have chef friends who collect salts from around the world just as a hobby,
Yeah.
right? Like baseball cards. They have salt from around the world. And friend brought back from Fiji a, a a pyramidical salt. It was shaped like a pyramid that was hollow, and it literally popped in your mouth when you ate it.
So when you're talking about the size of it, are you talking about it's uh, probably about half a centimeter large? Is that what you look?
If not a little bit larger even.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So but because it's hollow,
Hmm.
it didn't overwhelm with salt.
Right.
It's a really fun salt.
It's probably something really cool just to put on top of the dish, and then as you eat, you have this little cracking, popping sensation in your mouth.
Exactly. One of my favorite uses for salt is in desserts.
Hmm.
Salt accentuates flavors, and sweet flavors are not an exception to that. So, a pinch of salt in a vanilla pudding is an amazing thing to do. It
Yeah.
will change the profile dramatically.
Right, and I mentioned putting in ice cream. It's kind of the same principle as like kind of a pudding, that custardy type of foods. It goes great. So typically, there's even a specific type of salt for ice creams, isn't there? I think. No, you're shaking your head. So
Look, there are lots of things I don't know in the world.
yeah,
So,
yeah. I think I've seen. I could be mistaken, but I think I've seen some sort of ice cream salt, something like that. Um, And then we were talking about preserving foods. I know folk legend is that sushi was made by somebody salting fish and then having it preserved, and then that fish being taken away, dropped on some rice. I don't know. It's a whole folk legend where it was accidentally discovered by salting food and preserving it on rice.
right, and the rice originally with sushi was thrown away.
Yeah,
The rice was there to help preserve the fish.
right. Um, okay, what else on salt? I know we were just talking about a little bit ago that I have a friend that has a book on salt. You have a book on salt, so certainly there's a wide range of things that you can talk about.
Sure. To kind of continue the preservative aspect of it, there's the whole kind of questioned contemporarily, but the wonderful effect of nitrates. I'm sorry, the wonderful effect of nitrates on meats. Our corned beef, when you think of corned beef, it's pink.
Right.
It's pink because of curing salt.
I was actually just watching an episode of Good Eats last night, and they were talking about using saltpeter, and that's what creates the pinkness of corned beef.
It
Or it
preserves
helps.
the meat. It's the reason why you can have that stick of salami for a year and it doesn't go bad. More importantly, in human history to have food that was preserved that well, but it remains a flavor that we crave and an appearance that we look for. From a flavor aspect, you can corn beef without a curing salt,
Right.
but it's gray.
Yeah.
And culturally, we're just not gray's not an appealing color.
Yeah.
Um, so curing salt is usually, because it does involve an element that is poisonous. Curing salt is typically colored. Oftentimes, it's even sold as pink salt. And the reason behind that is it is colored so dramatically and in a non-food direction that you're not likely to mix it up.
Right.
Right? It not only is labeled as curing salt, but it is inherently different just to keep that separation in place.
Where does the toxicity come from? Is it the nitrates or okay?
And too much will actually not be good for you.
Okay.
But
Like fatal, not good, or just
I
probably upset
suppose
stomach?
water's fatal at
Yeah,
some
true.
point. So
Okay. What else about salt?
what else about salt?
I know
Curing, flavoring.
Yeah, one thing we talked about in the garlic episode is favorite applications of it, but salt is just so ingrained that you can't really have a favorite application of salt.
A different application of salt that I desperately love, I've done for many years, is the idea of a salt crust. Mixing salt with egg whites and making a dough out of it that in the oven when you bake it becomes rock hard. Makes a shell around the outside of food. One of the advantages is if you wrap a whole salmon, you stuff it with fennel and lemon slices in the belly, and then you wrap the whole salmon in a salt crust. You pop it in the oven and bake it, the salt becomes rock hard. However much salmon is in a salmon when you start, none of that salmonness can get away. It's all sealed inside the crust. Very dramatic presentation to take the back of a knife or a hammer and break the crust and peel it away, and then the food inside, like the salmon or the chicken or whatever it is you're cooking, keeps all of its inherent salmonness, and all of the moisture stays inside because it's a sealed container that you're cooking in. So not only is it visually dramatic to present at a table, but the flavor is intense and really delicious and moist because again the moisture can't get out. So
And because it's does the salt act when you're using that, does the salt shell act as an insulator where so you have to alter cooking times and
cooking time, one of the disadvantages of the method is without experience and or a really good recipe, or there's no way of telling what's happening in
yeah.
there, right? So as a chef,
You can't stick a thermometer in there and see
right,
what's going on. You have to keep that structure integrity throughout the
exactly.
entire process.
And so it's always a little scary cooking blind. Right? Anything could be happening in there. But that's kind of cushioned or balanced by the fact that whatever's happening in there, the moisture's staying in. It's a little harder to overcook something sealed away in a salt crust because none of the moisture's leaving. So
Yeah, you mentioned the salt crusting. I remember seeing those in cooking shows, and I always find it fascinating. I've never actually had it myself. I don't know what the experience is like, but I think you're absolutely correct saying it's a very dramatic presentation. It's really cool to watch. Um, Personally, I don't have a whole lot of dishes in mind where salt is the star, but I know salt is just a really interesting ingredient just because of its variety of uses. I know in Vietnamese cuisine we have or I don't know if it's just Vietnamese, it could just be Southeast Asian, but lemonade can be salted, and we have a drink that's a salty lemonade that's delicious, and it's so that's I mean it's just the creativity that you can use salt knows no bounds. It's a very versatile ingredient. Hmm. I don't know if you have anything else. If you,
um, other than other than what we've covered, no, I think it's a fun and easy experiment to make. So artisanal salts tend to cost a little bit more than a box of kosher salts do, but not too much more. And it's a fun experiment to go out and buy a small container of a sea salt, a Maldon salt, a fleur de sel, and just experiment with it. It's a wonderful change in a cornerstone of cooking, just to put a new kind of spin on it.
okay, cool. Well, without further ado, this has been episode 4 of Two Cooks Talking. I've been Long Nguyen,
And I'm Michael Weller.
and we'll talk to you next time.